The lecture hall was large and curved like the inside of a shell. Rows of seats rose up from the central floor where a single instructor stood beneath floating display screens. The room could hold over 100 students, but today only 47 seats were filled. Each seat held a different kind of alien, and each alien came from a different world somewhere in the vast stretch of the Galactic Union. In the back row, almost hidden in the shadows where the lights did not reach, sat. She was the only human in the room. Her skin was brown, her hair was black and pulled back in a simple tie, and her uniform was the same gray and blue that all cadets wore at the academy. She was 23 years old and had traveled 4 months through space to reach this place. Now she sat quietly and watched the instructor below. The instructor was called Ev. He was which meant he was tall and covered in scales that changed color with his mood. He had 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on his face, and when he spoke, his voice was deep and seemed to fill every corner of the room. They were an old species. They had been traveling between stars when humans were still living in caves and painting on walls. Eth touched a control on his wrist, and the floating screens behind him came to life with images. They showed weapons of all kinds: plasma rifles, sonic disruptors, gravity hammers, neural stunners. The weapons gleamed and spun slowly in the display. "Advanced survival tactics," Eth announced. "This is what you are here to learn. You will learn how to survive when everything goes wrong, when your ship crashes, when your team dies, when you are alone on a hostile world with nothing but your wits and your will to live." The students shifted in their seats. Some looked interested. Others looked bored. In the front row clicked his mandibles together in what might have been impatience. There were insect-like creatures with hard shells and multiple arms. They considered themselves superior warriors, and they did not hide this opinion from others. Eth continued, "Today we discuss improvised weaponry, the creation of weapons from available materials when standard equipment is unavailable." A tentacle rose from the middle section. It belonged to a species that looked like a collection of thick purple ropes woven into a roughly humanoid shape. They were known for their intelligence and their tendency to question everything. "Instructor," they said, "I must ask why this topic is relevant. We carry emergency beacons. If we are stranded, rescue will come within standard cycles. The Union guarantees this." Several other students made sounds of agreement. Whose body glowed with soft bioluminescent patches, flashed a pattern that indicated support for the question. Eth's scales shifted to a darker shade. Had learned that this meant annoyance, though they kept his voice calm. "And if your beacon is destroyed in the crash, if it is taken from you by hostile forces, if you are in a region where the Union has no presence and rescue will never come." The tentacles rippled. "These are unlikely scenarios." "Unlikely is not impossible," Eth said. "Every year, cadets die because they believed unlikely scenarios would never happen to them. This is why we study these things. Not because they are common, but because when they occur, preparation is the difference between survival and death." He turned back to his screens and brought up new images. These showed diagrams and equations, angles of force, tensile strength measurements, the physics of projectile motion. "We will examine the theoretical principles behind improvised weapon construction. Understanding these principles will allow you to assess any environment for potential resources. Leverage, tension, the conservation of energy. These are the foundations." Watch the equations scroll past. She understood them well enough. Humans had been studying these principles for thousands of years before they ever met an alien, but something bothered her about the lesson. It felt incomplete. It felt like reading about swimming without ever touching water. She raised her hand. Eth noticed the movement and paused, his 4 eyes focused on her location in the back row. "Yes, cadet." He consulted a tablet that floated near his hand. "The Terran representative." "Human," corrected gently. "We prefer human." "Human, then, you have a question." She was not tall by human standards, and compared to most of the species in the room, she was tiny. The in front could have crushed her with one armored limb. The instructor was nearly 3 times her mass, but stood anyway because sitting felt wrong for what she wanted to say. Not a question, instructor, an observation. The room grew quieter. Students turned to look at the human who had barely spoken a word in the 3 weeks since classes began. Go on, Eth said. You are teaching theory, said. Equations and principles and diagrams, but theory without demonstration is just. She searched for the right word. It is just words. It is information that sits in the mind but never reaches the hands. A soft chittering sound spread through the room. It was laughter, new. Alien laughter sounded different from human laughter, but the meaning was the same. They were laughing at her. The turned fully around in his seat. His compound eyes glittered in the light, and his mandibles spread in what might have been a smile. The mammal has opinions, he said. His voice was harsh and clicking. The soft little creature from the soft little world thinks she knows better than the instructor. Other students joined the laughter. The slight patterns shifted to amusement. Even the tentacles quivered in what seemed like humor. Waited for the laughter to fade. When it did, she spoke again. I am not saying I know better than anyone. I am saying that some things cannot be taught with words alone. Some things must be shown. Some things must be done. Eth raised a scaled hand and the remaining laughter stopped. His expression was unreadable, but his scales had shifted to a neutral gray. An interesting perspective, Cadet. Are you suggesting that you could provide such a demonstration? Yes. The word hung in the air, simple, direct, confident. They made a sound of contempt. With what? Humans have no natural weapons, no claws, no venom, no armor. You are prey animals who somehow learn to talk. Looked at him calmly. We are prey animals who learn to make predators extinct. The room went silent again, but this time the silence had a different quality. The laughter was gone. Something else had taken its place. Eth stepped forward. You claim you could construct a functional weapon. Here, now, from what materials? Let her eyes move across the room. She looked at the chairs bolted to the floor. She looked at the cable conduits running along the walls. She looked at the display screens and the acoustic panels and the metal support struts that held everything together. She had been looking at these things for 3 weeks. She had been thinking about them without really knowing why. Now she understood. From this classroom, she said, give me 20 minutes. The burst into clicking laughter. 20 minutes. The creature thinks she can make a weapon from chairs and cables in 20 minutes. He looked around at his fellow students, inviting them to share the joke. This I must see. Eth did not laugh. His 4 eyes studied with an intensity that made her skin prickle. For a long moment he said nothing. Then slowly his scales shifted to a color had not seen before. It was something between curiosity and respect. Very well, Cadet, 20 minutes. He turned to address the class. All students will observe and document, record everything. This will serve as an excellent case study. In what? They asked. In human foolishness. In adaptation, Eth said quietly. Or perhaps in humility, we shall see which. Walked down the steps toward the front of the room. With each step she felt the eyes of 46 aliens following her. They expected her to fail. They expected her to embarrass herself and confirm everything they believed about humans. Weak, primitive, irrelevant. She reached the floor and turned to face the instructor. I will need to disassemble some furniture and some wall panels. The Academy may want to bill me later. The Academy will bill you appropriately, Eth agreed, assuming you survive the next 20 minutes without dying of embarrassment. I have survived worse, said. She turned away from the instructor and walked to the nearest row of chairs. They were made of polymer and metal, designed to accommodate species of many different sizes and shapes. Crouched beside one and ran her fingers along its frame. The polymer seat was useless, but the support struts beneath were metal tubes, thin and flexible. She gripped one strut and pulled. The metal bent but did not break. She adjusted her grip, found the weakest point and twisted. With a sharp crack, the strut came free in her hands. Behind her, she heard surprised sounds from the students. They had expected her to struggle. They had not expected her to know exactly where to apply force. Tested the metal tube. She bent it slowly, feeling how it flexed, how it held tension, how it wanted to spring back to its original shape. Too rigid. The metal was too new, too strong. It would not bend enough without breaking. She dropped the strut and moved to another chair. This one was older, positioned in a corner where the lights were dimmer. Its metal had been stressed by years of use, by hundreds of different species sitting and shifting and pressing their weight against it. Could see the faint lines of fatigue in the frame. She pulled this strut free with the same technique. When she bent it, the metal curved smoothly, held its tension, then snapped back. She bent it again. The same result. The metal remembered its shape but accepted the bend. Perfect. What is she doing? The whispered, its lights flickering with confusion. She is making a bow, said a quiet voice from the upper rows. Looked up. The speaker was a species that resembled tall birds with arms instead of wings. There were solitary hunters on there. They understood weapons in ways that the other species did not. A bow, they asked. What is a bow? An ancient weapon, the said. One of the first that thinking beings ever created. It stores energy in a flexible frame and releases it to propel a projectile. The feathers on her head rose slightly. I did not think any species still knew how to make them. Smiled but did not respond. She had work to do, and the clock was already running. 18 minutes remained. Moved to the wall where cables ran behind protective panels. The panels were held in place by simple clips designed to be removed for maintenance. She pressed the release points and pulled the panel free, revealing bundles of fiber optic cables that carried data throughout the building. The cables were thin and individually weak, but was not interested in individual cables. She was interested in what they could become when combined. She pulled a bundle free from its housing. The cables were coated in polymer, smooth and slick. She stripped the coating from several strands, revealing the glass fibers beneath. These she discarded. What she needed was the polymer coating itself. Her fingers worked quickly, separating coating from fiber, building a pile of thin polymer strips. When she had enough, she began to braid. The braiding was automatic. Her hands knew the pattern without her mind needing to guide them. Over, under, twist and pull. Add another strand. Keep the tension even. Her grandmother had taught her this when she was 6 years old, sitting on the porch of their home in the mountains of what used to be called Chile. They had been making rope from plant fibers then, but the principle was the same. Everything was always the same. Materials changed, tools changed. The fundamental principles remained. A student clicked his mandibles. She is making string, he said with contempt. The human is making string. What thread is string? More than you might think, the replied quietly. Continued braiding. The cord grew longer and thicker. She tested its strength by wrapping it around her hands and pulling in opposite directions. The cord held. She pulled harder. Still it held. When she felt the first fibers begin to stretch, she stopped and added another layer of braiding. The instructor watched in silence. His 4 eyes tracked her every movement and his scales had shifted to a deep blue that did not recognize. She wondered what it meant but did not ask. Questions could wait. Work came first. 12 minutes remained. Turned to the metal strut she had selected. It was slightly curved from years of bearing weight, which suited her purpose well. She needed to create notches at each end to hold the string. For this, she needed something sharp. She walked to the instructor's display screens. They floated in the air, held by magnetic fields, but their frames were solid. Gripped the edge of one frame and pulled. The frame resisted for a moment, then separated from the screen with a metallic screech. The edge of the frame was sharp where it had broken. Not knife sharp, but enough. Pressed the edge against the metal strut and began to scrape. Metal shavings curled away as she carved a small notch near one end. Then she moved to the other end and repeated the process. She knows what she is doing, the said. There was something like wonder in her voice. This is not improvisation. This is practice. This is knowledge passed down through generations. The tentacles writhed with confusion. How can this be? Humans have only been in space for a few of their generations. They are children among the stars. Children who hunted mammoths with sticks and stones, the replied. Children who drove dozens of species to extinction using nothing but sharpened rocks and fire. I have studied their history. It is instructive. Was not listening. She was focused on her work, on the feeling of the metal in her hands, on the memory of her grandmother's voice explaining how their ancestors had survived in the high mountains before the cities came. When you have nothing, her grandmother had said, you make something. When you have something, you make it better. This is what it means to be human. We do not accept the world as it is. We change it. 9 minutes remained. The notches were complete. Picked up the braided cord and tied one end to the first notch, using a knot that her grandmother had called the anchor. The knot tightened under tension rather than loosening. It would hold. She bent the metal strut, curving it into a shallow arc. Her arms strained against the metal's resistance. This was the critical moment. If the metal was too weak, it would bend too far and lose its spring. If it was too strong, she would not be able to bend it enough to string it. The metal curved, felt it fighting her, trying to return to its original shape. She held it steady and brought the loose end of the cord to the second notch. Her fingers worked quickly, looping and tightening, creating the same anchor knot on the opposite end. She released her grip. The metal strut snapped into its new shape, pulling the cord tight. The tension sang through the frame, a hum that could feel in her bones. She held the bow up and examined her work. The curve was not perfect. The string was slightly uneven, but it would function. 6 minutes remained. Now she needed ammunition. Reached into her pocket and pulled out 3 styluses. They were standard Academy issue, available from any supply dispenser. Each student received 5 at the beginning of the term for taking notes and interacting with displays. Had taken only 3. She had modified them that morning before class. Using the rough concrete of the walkway outside her dormitory, she had ground the tips to points. Not sharp enough to pierce armor, but sharp enough to puncture flesh. Sharp enough to kill. Saw the styluses and made a sound of disbelief. Writing tools. She means to fight with writing tools. Did not respond. She was adding flights to the styluses using strips of the acoustic dampening foam she had pulled from beneath a desk. The foam was lightweight and would help stabilize the projectiles in flight. She cut small slits in the back of each stylus and wedged triangular pieces of foam into place. 4 minutes remained. Knocked one of the modified styluses against the string of her bow. She drew the string back slowly, feeling the tension build in the metal frame, in the braided cord, in her own arm and shoulder muscles. This was the ancient feeling, the prehistoric feeling. This was what her ancestors had felt 100,000 years ago when they hunted on the grasslands of Africa. Instructor, she said, her voice steady, I am ready to demonstrate. Eth stepped forward. The lecture hall had gone completely silent. No one was laughing anymore. No one was making sounds of contempt. Every eye and sensor in the room was fixed on the small human woman holding her improvised weapon. You have 3 minutes remaining, Eth said, but I see no target. Lowered the bow slightly. What would you suggest? The instructor turned and looked around the room. His eyes settled on the far wall, where a maintenance access panel bore the Academy's seal. The seal was a circle of interlocking symbols, one for each founding species of the Galactic Union. At the center was a small star, representing the unity of all worlds. The center of the seal, Eth said. The star. If you can hit that from here, I will admit that your demonstration has merit. Looked at the target. It was small, no larger than her closed fist. The distance was perhaps 30 meters. For a modern weapon, this would be trivially easy. For a bow made from furniture and cables with arrows made from writing tools, it was a true test. "Very well," she said. She raised the bow again. She drew the string to her cheek, feeling the rough cord against her skin. She aligned the tip of the stylus with the distant star. She controlled her breathing, slowing her heartbeat, steadying her hands. This was not about strength. This was about precision. This was about understanding how the arrow would fly, how the air would push against it, how gravity would pull it down. These calculations happened in a part of her brain that had no words, a part that had evolved over millions of years of hunting. Release the string. The stylus flew across the room in a blur of motion. It crossed the distance in less than a second, a streak of gray against the darker walls. Then, with a sharp crack that echoed through the silence, it struck the center of the seal. Not near the center, not close to the center. The exact center, the point where all the symbols met, where the small star represented the unity of worlds. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The sound of the impact seemed to hang in the air, refusing to fade. Then the stood. Her feathers were fully raised, a sign of deep respect among her people. "That was no luck," she said. "That was skill, skill that takes years to develop." She looked at with new eyes. "How many of your people can do this?" Lowered the bow, "More than you might think." Eth walked slowly toward the wall. He reached up and touched the embedded stylus, his scaled fingers exploring the depth of its penetration. The point had sunk nearly a centimeter into the hard material of the panel. "The metal was a chair leg," he said quietly. "The string was cable coating. The arrow was a writing tool." He turned to face the class. "She built this in less than 20 minutes, and she hit a target that most of our cadets could not hit with a standard sidearm." The stood abruptly. His mandibles worked in agitation. "This proves nothing. We have plasma weapons. We have sonic disruptors. We have technology that makes such primitive tools obsolete." "Does it?" Eth asked. "What happens when your plasma rifle runs out of charge? What happens when your sonic disruptor breaks? What happens when you are stripped of everything and left with only what you can find?" He gestured toward. "She would survive. She would not merely survive, she would fight. She would win." Walked forward and retrieved her arrow from the wall. The tip was slightly bent from the impact, but it could be straightened. It could be used again. Everything could be used again if you knew how. She turned to face the class. 46 pairs of alien eyes looked back at her. Some held surprise. Some held new respect. Some, like this compound eyes, held something that might have been the first stirrings of fear. "Humans do not have claws," said. "We do not have venom or armor or natural weapons of any kind. We are soft. We are slow. We are weak." She held up the bow. "So we learned to make tools. We learned to shape the world to our purposes. We learned that everything can be a weapon if you understand it well enough." She paused, letting her words settle into the silence. "This bow took me 18 minutes to make, but my ancestors spent 100,000 years learning how to make it. Every generation taught the next. Every improvement was remembered. We are not dangerous because of what we are. We are dangerous because of what we remember." Eth's scales had shifted to a color that finally recognized. It was the color of a who had learned something they had not expected to learn. It was the color of recalculation. "Class dismissed," the instructor said. "We will continue this discussion tomorrow. I have much to think about." The students rose slowly from their seats. They filed out of the lecture hall in near silence, casting glances at as they passed. The push through the crowd without looking at her, his armored body stiff with wounded pride. The lights flickered in complex patterns that could not read. The tentacles were still. Only the paused beside her. The tall bird-like alien looked down at with eyes that held something like recognition. My people were hunters once, the said. Before we joined the Union, before we built cities and starships, we hunted across the forests of our world. We have forgotten much of what we once knew. She reached out and touched the bow with careful fingers. I would be honored if you would teach me. Looked at her for a long moment, then she smiled. Tomorrow, she said, come early, we will start with the basics. The inclined her head in a gesture of thanks and left. Was alone in the lecture hall with Instructor Ev. He approached her slowly. He was still examining her with those 4 unblinking eyes, still processing what he had witnessed. When he spoke, his voice was different than it had been before. Quieter, more thoughtful. 240 years ago, he said, my people made first contact with yours. We found you on a small blue world fighting wars with nuclear weapons, balancing on the edge of destroying yourselves completely. We thought you were dangerous. We thought you were primitive. We thought these two things were contradictions. He reached out and took the bow from her hands. He held it carefully, turning it over, examining every knot and joint and curve. We thought you built weapons because you were primitive. We thought you would stop building them once you had our technology, our medicine, our wisdom. His scales shifted through several colors. We were wrong. You do not build weapons because you are primitive. You build weapons because it is who you are. It is written into your nature so deeply that you cannot see it anymore. It is like asking a fish to notice the water. He handed the bow back to her. I have taught this course for 30 years, Eth said. I have taught students from 100 different species. I have never had one build a weapon in my classroom. His eyes met hers. Report to the Applied Tactics Division tomorrow. Tell Director I that I sent you. Tell her that I finally understand why some members of the council are afraid of humans. Felt something tighten in her chest. Are you afraid of us? Eth considered the question. His scales cycled through colors she had no names for, emotions she could not read. Finally, they settled into a shade of deep green that seemed almost warm. No, he said, I am fascinated by you. I think the galaxy will be a more interesting place with humans in it. He paused. And I think that perhaps some fear is healthy. It keeps us from becoming complacent. He turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back. Keep the bow, he said. Consider it a teaching tool. Something tells me you will find uses for it that I cannot imagine. Then he was gone, and stood alone in the empty lecture hall with her improvised weapon, and the distant echo of history whispering through her bones. She ran her fingers along the curved metal, along the braided cord, along the sharp tip of her arrow. Everything in the room had been designed for other purposes. Chairs for sitting, cables for communication, styluses for writing. None of it had been meant to be a weapon. But humans saw weapons in everything. They always had, they always would. Shouldered her bow and walked out of the room, into a corridor filled with aliens who watched her pass with new eyes. Tomorrow she would meet with Director I. Tomorrow she would begin a new phase of her training. Tomorrow the galaxy would start to learn what it meant to share the stars with humanity. But today she had reminded herself of something important, something her grandmother had taught her long ago, in the mountains of a world that was now very far away. When you have nothing, you make something. When you have something, you make it better. This is what it means to be human. The next day began differently than any day before it. Woke in her small dormitory room, surrounded by bare walls and minimal furnishings. The room was designed to accommodate species of many different physiologies, which meant it was essentially a box with adjustable sleeping surfaces and basic sanitation facilities. Most students complained about the lack of comfort, found it refreshing. There was nothing here that did not serve a purpose. She dressed in her uniform and checked her reflection in the polished metal surface that served as a mirror. The face that looked back at her was serious, thoughtful, maybe a little tired. She had not slept well. Her mind had been turning over the events of the previous day, processing what had happened and what it might mean. She picked up the bow she had made and examined it in the morning light. In the harsh illumination, she could see every flaw, every imperfection. The curve of the metal was not symmetrical. The braiding of the cord was uneven in places. The notches she had carved were rough and would weaken the frame over time. It was not a good bow. It was barely functional. But it had worked. When it needed to work, it had worked. That was what mattered. She left the bow in her room and headed toward the Applied Tactics Division. The corridors of the academy were busy with students moving between classes, a flowing stream of different species and different shapes. Had learned to navigate these crowds without drawing attention to herself. Most species were larger than humans, and stepping in front of them could lead to accidental collisions or worse. Today was different. Today, eyes followed her as she walked. Conversations paused as she passed. She heard her name whispered in languages she did not understand, translated only partially by the small device implanted behind her ear. The human, the one with the bow, the one who hit the center of the seal, kept her eyes forward and her pace steady. She did not acknowledge the attention. She did not know how to feel about it yet. The Applied Tactics Division was located in a separate building on the far side of the academy grounds. It was a squat, reinforced structure with few windows and heavy blast doors. Had walked past it many times without ever going inside. It had always seemed like a place meant for others, for students who were more advanced, more experienced, more deserving. Now she approached the entrance and placed her hand on the identification panel. The panel scanned her palm, compared it to the academy's records, and the door slid open. Inside, the building was darker than the rest of the academy. The corridors were narrower, the ceilings lower. Everything felt compressed, intentional. This was not a place for lectures and theory. This was a place for action. Emerged from a doorway ahead. This one was female, smaller than Eth, but with scales that shimmered with more colors. She wore a uniform that was more practical than academic, with equipment harnesses and tool clips covering most of her body. "Cadet," she said, "I am Director I. Instructor Eth sent me a detailed message about you last night." "Yes, Director." I's scales flickered with something that might have been amusement. He used words I have never seen him use before. He called you remarkable. He called you dangerous. He called you a teaching moment for the entire academy. Did not know how to respond to this, so she said nothing. "Come with me," I said. "I want to see what you can do." She led deeper into the building, through corridors that twisted and turned in ways that seemed designed to confuse. Finally, they emerged into a large open space that took breath away. It was a simulation room, but unlike any she had seen before. The walls and ceiling were covered with projection surfaces and holographic emitters. The floor was made of adaptive material that could change its texture and hardness. Standing equipment lined the edges of the room, and in the center was a combat ring where two students were sparring with training weapons. "This is where we train soldiers," I said. "Not academics, not theorists, soldiers. The ones who go into situations where plasma rifles are not enough. The ones who need to survive no matter what happens." Watched the sparring match. One student was his multiple arms wielding 4 training blades simultaneously. The other was her long limbs allowing her to strike from unexpected angles. They moved with precision and power but could see the patterns in their movements. They were trained. They were skilled, but they were predictable. "What do you want me to do?" asked. I's scales shifted to a calculating shade. "I want you to spar." "Against one of them." "Against both of them." Looked at the director. This expression was unreadable. "Is this a test?" "Everything is a test, Cadet. How you respond determines what kind of training you receive." I gestured toward the ring. "Show me what a human can do when the odds are against her." The sparring match ended, and the two students turned to see approaching. The mandibles spread in recognition. This was not the same from her tactics class, but word had apparently spread. The tilted her head with interest. "A new challenger," they said. The famous human, I have been wanting to meet you. The fame is accidental, said. I just did what seemed necessary. They made a soft sound that might have been appreciation. Humility is a rare quality. Let us see if your actions match your words. Training weapons were brought too. She examined them carefully, testing their weight and balance. The selection included blades of various sizes, impact weapons, and even a few projectile launchers that fired marking rounds. Set aside the launchers and picked up two short clubs made of a dense polymer material. They clicked his mandibles in surprise. No blades, no distance weapons. You choose to fight close with impact weapons. I choose what I know, said. They took their positions in the ring. I raised her hand and the room fell silent. Then her hand dropped and the match began. The charged immediately, his forearms blurring with speed. Had expected this. She had watched him fight, had seen how he used his extra limbs to overwhelm opponents with a storm of attacks. He was aggressive. He was powerful. He expected to end fights quickly. Step to the side and let him pass. His momentum carried him past her, and she struck his rear leg as he went by. Not hard enough to damage, but hard enough to register. They stumbled and turned, his compound eyes narrowing with surprise. There was more cautious. She circled around, using her reach to probe defenses, kept both opponents in her field of vision, moving constantly, never letting either of them get behind her. This was basic survival technique, drilled into her during years of training on Earth before she ever applied to the academy. They struck, her long arm extending with a blade aimed at shoulder, blocked with one club and swung the other at this extended arm. The bird-like alien pulled back just in time, feathers ruffling with alarm. She is fast, they said, faster than she looks. Humans are endurance predators, replied, her breathing still controlled and even. We evolved to chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Speed is not our strength. Persistence is. He attacked again, this time more carefully. He used his forearms to create a pattern of strikes that covered multiple angles simultaneously. Could not block all of them. She did not try. Instead, she accepted two glancing blows to her arms in order to deliver a solid strike to the center mass. The hit registered on the training system with a chime. Point 2. How did you do that? They demanded. You let me hit you. I traded pain for opportunity, said. Humans are good at enduring pain. It is one of our few advantages. The match continued. Did not win, not exactly. The combined skill of her two opponents was too much for her to overcome. But she lasted longer than anyone expected, scored more points than seemed possible, and demonstrated something that made I's scales shift to a thoughtful shade of green. When the match finally ended, was bruised and breathing hard, but she was still standing. The were looking at her with expressions that had never seen on alien faces before. Respect, true respect, earned through action rather than words. Enough, I called out. Cadet, come with me. Limped out of the ring and followed the director to a private observation room overlooking the training floor. Through the window, she could see other matches beginning, other students testing themselves against each other. You lasted 12 minutes against two opponents who have been training here for over a year, I said. You should have lasted perhaps 3. I have been training since I was 5 years old, said. Different places, different teachers, but always training. It is how humans raise their children. We prepare them for a world that is trying to kill them. I was silent for a moment. Eth was right about you. You are remarkable, she paused. And you are dangerous, but not in the way he meant. What do you mean? The director turned to face her. You are dangerous because you do not know your own limits. You push beyond what you should be able to do because you do not accept that limits exist. This is inspiring. Her scales darkened slightly. It is also reckless. Considered this. My grandmother used to say that limits are just lines drawn by people who stop trying. Your grandmother was either very wise or very foolish. She survived things that should have killed her, said. I think that makes her wise. I made a sound that might have been a laugh. You humans are difficult to argue with. Very well. I will accept you into the Applied Tactics program, but you will work harder than any student before you. You will learn things that are not taught in any classroom, and you will help me understand something that has puzzled me for many years. What is that? The director's four eyes focused on with uncomfortable intensity. I want to understand why the galaxy fears you. Not your weapons, not your starships, not your technology. You, the small, soft, vulnerable creatures who somehow claw their way to victory against every odd. She leaned forward. I want to understand what makes humans so difficult to defeat. Met her gaze without flinching. I will try to show you, Director, but I do not think it is something that can be taught. It is something that must be lived. Then live it, I said. Show me, show all of us, and perhaps together we will learn something new about what it means to survive. She extended her hand in the human gesture of agreement, took it. Welcome to Applied Tactics, Cadet. Your real training begins now. The following weeks were the hardest of life. Director I had not been exaggerating when she said would work harder than any student before her. The training schedule was brutal, designed for species with greater strength and endurance than humans possessed, was expected to keep up anyway. She ran obstacle courses designed for beings with four legs. She climbed structures meant for creatures with claws. She sparred against opponents who could crush her with a casual blow. Every day, she pushed her body past the point of exhaustion, slept for a few hours, and then did it again. But something strange happened as the weeks passed. Did not break. She bent, she struggled, she bled, but she did not break. And gradually, imperceptibly at first, she began to improve. Her body adapted. Her muscles grew denser. Her reflexes sharpened. She learned to read the movements of alien species, to anticipate their attacks, to find the weaknesses in forms that were utterly unlike her own. She learned that every advantage came with a disadvantage, every strength with a corresponding weakness. They were fast and strong, but their compound eyes could be confused by rapid movements at certain angles. They had incredible reach, but their hollow bones made them vulnerable to grappling. They were powerful and well-armored, but they overheated quickly in prolonged combat. Every species had its cracks. Learn to find them. She also learned something else, something more important. She learned that she was not alone. Other students began to seek her out. From her first sparring match, whose name was, became a regular training partner. The two of them developed a silent understanding, a rhythm of combat that made them more effective together than either was alone. A young named Pulse began following around, asking questions about human history and tactics, his bioluminescent patches glowing with fascination. Even some of the, proud and stubborn as they were, began to show grudging respect. They did not want to admit that a human could compete with them, but they could not deny what they saw in the training ring, day after day. The small human who refused to stay down. The soft creature who kept getting up no matter how many times she was knocked to the ground. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session, sat alone in the observation room, looking out at the empty training floor. Her body ached in places she had not known could ache. Her uniform was stained with sweat and other fluids she preferred not to think about. She was tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. The door opened, and Instructor Eth entered. He had visited the Applied Tactics Division several times since transfer, observing her progress from a distance. This was the first time he had approached her directly. "Cadet," he said, "may I join you?" "Of course, Instructor." He sat beside her, his large form making the chair seem small. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked out at the empty room where so many battles had been fought. "I have watched your progress," Eth finally said. "It has been impressive." "Thank you, Instructor. But I must confess something to you." His scales shifted to a color had learned to recognize as discomfort. When I invited you to demonstrate improvised weaponry in my classroom, I did not expect you to succeed. I expected you to fail. I expected to use your failure as a teaching example, to show the class what happens when enthusiasm exceeds ability. Looked at him, I know. You know. It was obvious, Instructor. The way you smiled when I accepted the challenge, the way you set the timer. You were preparing a lesson in humility. She shrugged, and the movement sent pain through her tired shoulders. But I could not refuse. If I had refused, I would have confirmed everything the other students believed about humans, that we are weak, that we do not belong here. Eth was silent for a moment. And now, do you feel that you belong? Considered the question. She thought about the weeks of brutal training, the injuries she had sustained, the moments when she had wanted nothing more than to quit and go home. She thought about, and Pulse, and the grudging respect of the. She thought about what it meant to be the only human in a galaxy full of beings who saw her species as children at best and threats at worst. I do not know if I belong, she said honestly, but I know that I am here, and I know that I will not leave until I have proven something. Proven what? That humans are not what the galaxy thinks we are, that we are not dangerous because we are primitive or violent or irrational. We are dangerous because we refuse to accept defeat. We are dangerous because we keep trying, keep adapting, keep surviving no matter what the universe throws at us. She met his 4 eyes with her too. We are dangerous because we do not know when to give up. Eth's scales shifted through several colors, before settling on the warm green that had come to associate with approval. 240 years, he said softly. In 240 years, your species has gone from nuclear weapons and planetary wars to starships and galactic membership. We thought it was because you are technology. We thought you were good imitators. But that is not it, is it? No, agreed. We are good adapters, there is a difference. Yes, the rose from his seat. There is a significant difference, and I suspect the galaxy will spend the next few centuries learning just how significant that difference is. He moved toward the door, then paused. Cadet, when you graduate from this program, and you will graduate, I am certain of it now, what do you intend to do? Smiled, though she did not feel particularly happy. I intend to go wherever I am needed, Instructor. I intend to do whatever needs to be done, and I intend to show the galaxy what humans are capable of. Eth nodded slowly. That is what I was afraid of. His scales flickered with something that might have been dark humor, and that is why I look forward to seeing what you become. He left, remained in the observation room, watching the lights of the training floor dim as night fell over the academy. In her mind, she was already planning tomorrow's training. There was always more to learn. There was always another challenge to face. And there was always another way to adapt. This was what it meant to be human. And the galaxy was only beginning to understand. The stars outside the observation window seemed to pulse with distant light, each one a sun with worlds of its own, each world full of beings who had their own histories and their own stories. Humans were just one species among thousands, latecomers to a civilization that had been building itself for millions of years. But they were here now, and they were not going anywhere. Closed her eyes and let herself rest, just for a moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to prove herself, to learn, to grow. For now, she was content to be exactly where she was, a human among aliens, a student among warriors, a small, soft, vulnerable creature who had built a bow from classroom furniture and hit the center of a target that should have been impossible. The galaxy might fear humans, or it might come to respect them, or it might learn, eventually, that humans were simply another thread in the vast tapestry of intelligent life, no better and no worse than any other. But suspected that the truth was more complicated than any of these simple possibilities. She suspected that humans would change the galaxy in ways that no one could predict simply by being what they were. Not conquerors, not destroyers, just survivors doing whatever it took to endure. Her grandmother had been right. When you have nothing, you make something. When you have something, you make it better. And when the universe tells you that you cannot survive, you find a way to survive anyway. This was the human way. This was what the galaxy would learn. One bow at a time.